the world's #1 storyteller. Roald Dahl. Going Solo. Cover illustrations by Quentin Blake.
Puffin Books.
Going Solo. Going Solo is Roald Dahl's marvelous evocation of his wartime exploits. Continuing the story he began in Boy, it is a series of superb stories and daring deeds, telling of African safaris, encounters with the enemy and pertinent advice on what to do to avoid snake bites and what not to do if you find yourself in a lion's mouth. It is hard to imagine a more colorful and exciting autobiography. Roald Dahl was born in 1916 in Wales of Norwegian parents. He was educated in England before starting work for the Shell Oil Company in Africa. He began writing after a monumental bash on the head sustained as an RAF fighter pilot during the Second World War. Roald Dahl is one of the most successful and well-known of all children's writers. His books, which are read by children the world over, include James and the Giant Peach, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, The Magic Finger, Fantastic Mr. Fox, The Twits, The BFG, The Witches, winner of the 1983 Whitbread Award, and Matilda, which won the Children's Book Award. Roald Dahl died in 1990 at the age of 74. A life is made up of a great number of small incidents and a small number of great ones. An autobiography must therefore, unless it is to become tedious, be extremely selective, discarding all the inconsequential incidents in one's life and concentrating upon those that have remained vivid in the memory. The first part of this book takes up my own personal story precisely where my earlier autobiography, which was called Boy, left off. I am away to East Africa on my first job, but because any job, even if it is in Africa, is not continuously enthralling, I have tried to be as selective as possible and have written only about those moments that I consider memorable. In the second part of the book, which deals with the time I went flying with the RAF in the Second World War, there was no need to select or discard because every moment was, to me at any rate, totally enthralling. R.D. The Voyage Out. The ship that was carrying me away from England to Africa in the autumn of 1938 was called the SS Manora. She was an old paint-peeling tub of 9,000 tons with a single tall funnel and a vibrating engine that rattled the teacups in their saucers on the dining room table. The voyage from the port of London to Mombasa would take 2 weeks, and on the way we were going to call in at Marseilles, Malta, Port Said, Suez, Port Sudan and Aden. Nowadays you can fly to Mombasa in a few hours and you stop nowhere and nothing is fabulous anymore, but in 1938 a journey like that was full of stepping stones and East Africa was a long way from home, especially if your contract with the Shell Company said that you were to stay out there for 3 years at a stretch. I was 22 when I left. One would be 25 before I saw my family again. What I still remember so clearly about that voyage is the extraordinary behavior of my fellow passengers. I had never before encountered that peculiar empire-building breed of Englishman who spends his whole life working in distant corners of British territory. Please do not forget that in the 1930s the British Empire was still very much the British Empire, and the men and women who kept it going were a race of people that most of you have never encountered and now you never will. I consider myself very lucky to have caught a glimpse of this rare species while it still roamed the forests and foothills of the earth, for today it is totally extinct. More English than the English, more Scottish than the Scots, they were the craziest bunch of humans I shall ever meet. For one thing, they spoke a language of their own. If they worked in East Africa, their sentences were sprinkled with Swahili words, and if they lived in India then all manner of dialects were intermingled. As well as this, there was a whole vocabulary of much-used words that seemed to be universal among all these people. An evening drink, for example, was always a sundowner. A drink at any other time was a chota peg. One's wife was the mem sahib. To have a look at something was to have a shufti. And from that one, interestingly enough, RAF/Middle East slang for a reconnaissance plane in the last war was a shufti kite. Something of poor quality was shensi. Supper was tiffin and so on and so forth. The empire builder's jargon would have filled a dictionary. All in all, it was rather wonderful for me, a conventional young lad from the suburbs, to be thrust suddenly into the middle of this pack of sinewy sunburnt gophers and their bright bony little wives, and what I liked best of all about them was their eccentricities. It would seem that when the British live for years in a foul and sweaty climate among foreign people, they maintain their sanity by allowing themselves to go slightly dotty. They cultivate bizarre habits that would never be tolerated back home, whereas in faraway Africa or in Ceylon or in India or in the Federated Malay States they could do as they liked. On the SS Manora just about everybody had his or her own particular maggot in the brain, and for me it was like watching a kind of non-stop pantomime throughout the entire voyage. Let me tell you about 2 or 3 of these comedians. I was sharing my cabin with the manager of a cotton mill in the Punjab called Uncle Savory. I could hardly believe those initials when I first saw them on his trunk, and I had the upper berth. From my pillow I could therefore look out of the porthole clear across the lifeboat deck and over the wide blue ocean beyond. On our 4th morning at sea, I happened to wake up very early. I lay in my bunk gazing idly through the porthole and listening to the gentle snores of Uncle Savory, who lay immediately below me. Suddenly, the figure of a naked man, naked as a jungle ape, went swooshing past the porthole and disappeared. He had come and gone in absolute silence, and I lay there wondering whether perhaps I had seen a phantom or a vision or even a naked ghost. A minute or 2 later the naked figure went by again. This time I sat up sharply. I wanted to get a better look at his leafless phantom of the sunrise, so I crawled down to the foot of my bunk and stuck my head through the porthole. The lifeboat deck was deserted. The Mediterranean was calm and milky blue, and a brilliant yellow sun was just edging up over the horizon. The deck was so empty and silent that I began to wonder seriously whether I might not after all have seen a genuine apparition, the ghost perhaps of a passenger who had fallen overboard on an earlier voyage and who now spent his eternal life running above the waves and clambering back onto his lost ship. All of a sudden, from my little spy hole, I spotted a movement at the far end of the deck. Then a naked body materialized. But this was no ghost. It was all too solid flesh, and the man was moving swiftly over the deck between the lifeboats and the ventilators and making no sound at all as he came galloping towards me. He was short and stocky and slightly pot-bellied in his nakedness, with a big black mustache on his face, and when he was 20 yards away he caught sight of my silly head sticking out of the porthole and he waved a hairy arm at me and called out, "Come along, my boy. Come and join me in a canter. Blow some sea air into your lungs. Get yourself in trim. Shake off the flab." By his mustache alone I recognized him as Major Griffiths, a man who had told me only the night before at the dinner table how he had spent 36 years in India and was returning once again to Allahabad after the usual home leave. I smiled weakly at the Major as he went prancing by, but I didn't pull back. I wanted to see him again. There was something rather admirable about the way he was galloping round and round the deck with no clothes on at all, something wonderfully innocent and unembarrassed and cheerful and friendly. And here was I, a bundle of youthful self-consciousness, gaping at him through the porthole and disapproving quite strongly of what he was doing. But I was also envying him. I was actually jealous of his total don't-give-a-damn attitude, and I wished like mad that I myself had the guts to go out there and do the same thing. I wanted to be like him. I longed to be able to fling off my pajamas and go scampering round the deck in the all together and to hell with anyone who happened to see me. But not in a million years could I have done it. I waited for him to come round again. Ah, there he was. One could see him far away down the deck, the gallant galloping Major who didn't give a fig for anybody, and I decided right then that I would say something very casual to him this time to show him I was one of the gang and that one had not even noticed his nakedness. But hang on a minute. What was this? There was someone with him. There was another fellow scooting along beside him this time. As naked as the Major he was, too. What on earth was going on aboard this ship? Did all the male passengers get up at dawn and go tearing round the deck with no clothes on? Was this some empire-building, body-building ritual one didn't know about? The two were coming closer now. My God, the second one looked like a woman. It was a woman! A naked woman as bare-bosomed as Venus de Milo. But there the resemblance ceased, for I could see now that the scrawny white-skinned figure was none other than Mrs. Major Griffiths herself. I froze in my porthole and my eyes became riveted on this nude female scarecrow galloping ever so proudly alongside her bearskin spouse, her elbows bent and her head held high, as much as to say, "Aren't we a jolly fine couple, the two of us, and isn't he a fine figure of a man, my husband the Major?" "Come along there," the Major called out to me. "If the little memsahib can do it, so can you. 50 times round the deck is only 4 miles. Lovely morning," I murmured as they went galloping by. Beautiful day. A couple of hours later, I was sitting opposite the Major and his little memsahib at breakfast in the dining room, and the knowledge that not long ago I had seen that same little memsahib with not a stitch on her made my spine creep. I kept my head down and pretended neither of them were there. "Ha!" the Major cried suddenly. "Aren't you the young fellow who had his head sticking through the porthole this morning?" "Who, me?" I murmured, keeping my nose in the cornflakes. "Yes, you," the Major cried, triumphant. "I never forget a face." I was just getting a breath of air." I mumbled. "You were getting a darn sight more than that," the Major cried out, grinning. "You were getting an eyeful of the memsahib, that's what you were doing." The whole of our table of 8 people suddenly became silent and looked in my direction. I felt my cheeks beginning to boil. "I can't say I blame you," the Major went on, giving his wife an enormous wink. It was his turn to be proud and gallant now. "In fact, I don't blame you at all." "Would you blame him?" he asked, addressing the rest of the table. "After all, we're only young once. And, as the poet says." He paused, giving the dreadful wife another colossal wink. "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." "Oh, do shut up, Bonzo," the wife said, loving it. "Back in Allahabad," the Major said, looking at me now. "I make a point of playing half a dozen chukkas every morning before breakfast. Can't do that on board ship, you know. So I have to get my exercise in other ways." I sat there wondering how one played this game of checkers. "Why can't you do it?" I said, desperate to change the subject. "Why can't I do what?" the Major said. "Play checkers on the ship?" I said. The Major was one of those men who chewed his porridge. He stared at me with pale gray glassy eyes, chewing slowly. "I hope you're not trying to tell me that you have never played polo in your life," he said. "Polo," I said. "Ah yes, of course, polo. At school we used to play it on bicycles with hockey sticks." The Major's stare switched suddenly to a fierce glare and he stopped chewing. He glared at me with such contempt and horror, and his face went so crimson, I thought he might be going to have a seizure. From then on, neither the Major nor his wife would have anything to do with me. They changed their table in the dining room and they cut me dead whenever we met on deck. I had been found guilty of a great and unforgivable crime. I had jeered, or so they thought, at the game of polo, the sacred sport of Anglo-Indians and royalty. Only a bounder would do that. Then there was the elderly Miss Trusus, who quite often sat at the same dining room table as me. Miss Trusus was all bones and gray skin, and when she walked her body was bent forward in a long curve like a boomerang. She told me she owned a small coffee farm in the highlands of Kenya, and that she had known Baroness Blixen very well. I myself had read and loved both Out of Africa and 7 Gothic Tales, and I listened enthralled to everything Miss Trusus told me about that fine writer who called herself Isaac Dinesen. She was dotty, of course, Miss Trusus said. Like all of us who live out there, she went completely dotty in the end. "You aren't dotty," I said. Oh yes, I am, she said firmly and very seriously. Everyone on this ship is as dotty as a dumpling. You don't notice it because you're young. Young people are not watchful. They only look at themselves. I saw Major Griffiths and his wife running round the deck naked the other morning, I said. You call that dotty? Miss Trusus said with a snort. That's normal. I didn't think so. You've got a few shocks coming to you, young man, before you're very much older, you mark my words, she said. People go quite barmy when they live too long in Africa. That's where you're off to, isn't it? Yes, I said. You'll go barmy for sure, she said, like the rest of us. She was eating an orange at the time and I noticed suddenly that she was not eating it in the normal way. In the first place she had speared it from the fruit bowl with her fork instead of taking it in her fingers. And now, with KNTFR and fork, she was making a series of neat incisions in the skin all around the orange. Then, very delicately, using the points of her knife and fork, she peeled the skin away in 8 separate pieces, leaving the bare fruit beautifully exposed. Still using knife and fork, she separated the juicy segments and began to eat them slowly, one by one, with her fork. Do you always cut an orange like that? I said. Of course. May I ask why? I never touch anything I eat with my fingers, she said. Good Lord, don't you really? Never. I haven't since I was 22. Is there a reason for that? I asked her. Of course there's a reason. Fingers are filthy. But you wash your hands. I don't sterilize them, Miss Trusus said. Nor do you. They're full of bugs. Disgusting dirty things, fingers. Just think what you do with them. I sat there going through the things I did with my fingers. It doesn't bear thinking about, does it? Miss Trusus said. Fingers are just implements. They are the gardening implements of the body, the shovels and the forks. You push them into everything. We seem to survive, I said. Not for long you won't, she said darkly. I watched her eating her orange, spearing the little boats one after the other with her fork. I could have told her that the fork wasn't sterilized either, but I kept quiet. Toes are even worse, she said suddenly. I beg your pardon? They're the worst of all, she said. What's wrong with toes? They are the nastiest part of the human body, she announced vehemently. Worse than fingers? There's no comparison, she snapped. Fingers are foul and filthy, but toes? Toes are reptilian and viperish. I don't wish to talk about them. I was getting a bit confused. But one doesn't eat with one's toes, I said. I never said you did, Miss Trusus snapped. Then what's so awful about them? I persisted. Ugh, she said. They are like little worms sticking out of your feet. I hate them, I hate them. I can't bear to look at them. Then how do you cut your toenails? I don't, she said. My boy does it for me. I wondered why she was Miss if she'd been married and had a boy of her own. Perhaps he was illegitimate. How old is your son? I asked, treading carefully. No, 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 she cried. Don't you know anything? A boy is one's native servant. Didn't you learn that when you read Isaac Dinesen? Ah yes, of course, I said, remembering. Absent-mindedly I took an orange myself and was about to start peeling it. Don't, Miss Trusus said, shuddering. You'll catch something if you do that. Use your knife and fork. Go on. Try it. I tried it. It was rather fun. There was something satisfying about cutting the skin to just the right depth and then peeling away the segments. "There you are," she said. "Well done. Do you employ a lot of boys on your coffee farm?" I asked her. "About 50, she said. "Do they go barefoot?" "Mine don't," she said. "No one works for me without shoes on. It costs me a fortune, but it's worth it." I liked Miss Trusus. She was impatient, intelligent, generous, and interesting. I felt she would come to my rescue at any time, whereas Major Griffiths was vapid, vulgar, arrogant, and unkind, the sort of man who'd leave you to the crocodiles. He might even push you in. Both of them, of course, were completely dotty. Everyone on the ship was dotty, but none, as it turned out, was quite as dotty as my cabin companion, Uncle Savory. The first sign of his dottiness was revealed to me one evening as our ship was running between Malta and Port Said. It had been a stifling hot afternoon and I was having a brief rest on my upper berth before dressing for dinner. Dressing? Oh yes, indeed. We all dressed for dinner every single evening on board that ship. The male species of the empire builder, whether he is camping in the jungle or is at sea in a rowing boat, always dresses for dinner, and by that I mean white shirt, black tick, dinner jacket, black trousers and black patent leather shoes, the full regalia, and to hell with the climate. I lay still on my bunk with my eyes half open. Below me, Uncle Savory was getting dressed. There wasn't room in the cabin for two of us to change our clothes simultaneously, so we took it in turns to go first. It was his turn to dress first tonight. He had tied his bow tie and now he was putting on his black dinner jacket. I was watching him rather dreamily through half-closed eyes, and I saw him reaching into his sponge bag and take out a small carton. He stationed himself in front of the washbasin mirror, took the lid off the carton and dipped his fingers into it. The fingers came out with a pinch of white powder or crystals, and this stuff he proceeded to sprinkle very carefully over the shoulders of his dinner jacket. Then he replaced the lid on the carton and put it back in the sponge bag. Suddenly I was fully alert. What on earth was the man up to? I didn't want him to know I'd seen, so I closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep. This is a rum business, I thought. Why in the world would Uncle Savory want to sprinkle white stuff on to the shoulders of his dinner jacket? And what was it, anyway? Could it be some subtle perfume or a magic aphrodisiac? I waited until he had left the cabin, then, feeling only slightly guilty, I hopped down from my bunk and opened his sponge bag. Epsom salts, it said on the little carton. And Epsom salts it was. Now what good could Epsom salts possibly do him sprinkled on his shoulders? I had always thought of him as a queer fish, a man with secrets, though I hadn't discovered what they were. Under his bunk he kept a tin trunk and a black leather case. There was nothing odd about the tin trunk, but the case puzzled me. It was roughly the size of a violin case, but the lid didn't bulge as the lid of a violin case does, and it wasn't tapered. It was simply a 3-foot-long rectangular leather box with two very strong brass locks on it. "Do you play the violin?" I had once said to him. "Don't be daft," he had answered. "I don't even play the gramophone." Perhaps it contained a sawn-off shotgun then, I told myself. It was about the right size. I put the carton of Epsom salts back in his sponge bag, then I took a shower, dressed and went upstairs to have a drink before dinner. There was one stool vacant at the bar, so I sat down and ordered a glass of beer. There were 8 sinewy sunburnt gophers including Uncle Savory sitting on high stools at the bar. The stools were screwed to the floor. The bar was semicircular so that everyone could talk across to everyone else. Uncle Savory was sitting about 5 places away from me. He was drinking a gimlet, which was the empire builder's name for a gin with lime juice in it. I sat there listening to the small talk about pig sticking and polo and how curry will cure constipation. I felt a total outsider. There was nothing I could contribute to the conversation, so I stopped listening and concentrated on trying to solve the riddle of the Epsom salts. I glanced at Uncle Savory. From where I sat, I could actually see the tiny white crystals on his shoulders. Then a funny thing happened. Uncle Savory suddenly began brushing the Epsom salts off one of his shoulders with his hand. He did it ostentatiously, slapping the shoulder quite hard and saying at the same time in a rather loud voice, "Ready, dandruff. I'm fed up with it. Do any of you fellers know a good cure? Try coconut oil," one said. Bay rum and cantharides, another said. A tea planter from Assam called Unsworth said, "Take my word for it, old man, you've got to stimulate the circulation in the scalp. And the way to do that is to dunk your hair in ice-cold water every morning and keep it there for 5 minutes. Then dry vigorously. You've got a fine head of hair at the moment, but you'll be as bald as a coot in no time if you don't cure that dandruff. You do as I say, old man." Uncle Savory did indeed have a fine head of black hair, so why in the world should he have wanted to pretend he had dandruff when he hadn't? "Thanks a lot, old man," Uncle Savory said. "I'll give it a go. See if it works." "It'll work," Unsworth told him. "My grandmother cured her dandruff that way." "Your grandmother?" someone said. "Did she have dandruff?" "When she combed her hair," Unsworth said, "it looked like it was snowing." For the 100th time, I told myself that they were all totally and incurably dotty, every one of them, but I was beginning to think now that Uncle Savory might beat them all to it. I sat there staring into my beer and trying to figure out why he should go around trying to kid everyone he had. Dandruff. 3 days later I had the answer. It was Carly evening. We were moving slowly through the Suez Canal and it was hotter than ever. It was my turn to dress first for dinner. While I showered and put on my clothes, Uncle Savory lay on his bunk staring into space. "It's all yours," I said at last as I opened the door and went out. "See you upstairs." As usual, I scacked myself at the bar and began sipping a beer. By gosh, it was hot. The big slowly revolving fan in the ceiling seemed to be blowing steam out of its blades. Sweat trickled down my neck and under my stiff butterfly collar. I could feel the starch in the collar going soggy around the back. The sinewy sunburnt ones around me didn't seem to notice the heat. I decided to go out on deck and smoke a pipe before dinner. It would be cooler there. I felt for my pipe. Damnation, I had left it behind. I stood up and made my way downstairs to the cabin and opened the door. There was a strange man sitting in shirt sleeves on Uncle Savory's bunk, and as I stepped inside, the man gave a queer little yelp and jumped to his feet as though a cracker had gone off in the seat of his pants. The stranger was totally bald, and that is why it took me a second or two to realize that he was in fact none other than Uncle Savory himself. It is extraordinary how hair on the head or the lack of it will completely change a person's appearance. Uncle Savory looked like a different man. To start with, he looked 15 years older, and in some subtle way he seemed also to have diminished, grown much shorter and smaller. As I said, he was almost totally bald, and the dome of his head was as pink and shiny as a ripe peach. He was standing up now and holding in his 2 hands the wig he had been about to put on as I walked in. "You had no right to come back," he shouted. "You said you'd finished." Little sparks of fury were flashing in his eyes. I'm most awfully sorry," I stammered. "I forgot my pipe." He stood there glaring at me with that dark malevolent glint in his eye, and I could see little droplets of perspiration oozing out of the pores on his bald head. I felt very bad. I didn't know what to say next. "Just let me get my pipe and I'll clear out," I mumbled. "Oh no you don't," he shouted. "You've seen it now and you're not leaving this room until you've made me a promise." You've got to promise me you won't tell a soul. Promise me that. Behind him I could see that curious black leather violin case lying open on his bunk, and in it, nestling alongside each other like three large black hairy hedgehogs, lay three more wigs. There's nothing wrong with being bald, I said. I didn't ask for your opinion, he shouted. He was still very angry. I just want your promise. I won't tell anyone, I said. I give you my word. And you'd better keep it, he said. I reached out and took hold of the pipe that was lying on my bunk. Then I began rummaging round in various places for my tobacco pouch. Uncle Savory sat down on the lower bunk. I suppose you think I'm crazy, he said. Suddenly all the bark had gone out of his voice. I said nothing. I could think of nothing to say. You do, don't you? He said. You think I'm crazy. Not at all, I answered. A man can do as he likes. I'll bet you think it's just vanity, he said. But it's not. Vanity. It's nothing to do with vanity. It's okay, I said. Really it is. It's business, he said. I do it purely for business reasons. I work in Amritsar, in the Punjab. That is the homeland of the Sikhs. To a Sikh, hair is a sort of religion. A Sikh never cuts his hair. He either rolls it up on the top of his head or in a turban. A Sikh doesn't respect a bald man. In that case, I think it's very clever of you to wear a wig. I said. I had to live in this cabin with Uncle Savory for several days yet and I didn't want to row. It's quite brilliant, I added. Do you honestly think so? He said, melting. It's a stroke of genius. I go to a lot of trouble to convince all those Sikh wallas it's my own hair, he went on. You mean the dandruff bit? You saw it, then? Of course I saw it. It was brilliant. It's just one of my little ruses, he said. He was getting just a trifle smug now. No one's going to suspect me of wearing a wig if I've got dandruff, are they? Certainly not. It's quite brilliant. But why bother doing it here? There aren't any Sikhs on this ship. You never know, he said darkly. You never can tell who might be lurking around the corner. The man was as potty as a pilchard. I see you have more than one, I said, pointing to the black leather case. One's no good, he said, not if you're going to do it properly like me. I always carry 4, and they're all slightly different. You are forgetting that hair grows, old man, aren't you? Each one of these is longer than the other. I put on a longer one every week. What happens after you've worn the longest one and you can't go any further? I asked. Ah, he said. That's the clincher. I don't quite follow you. I simply say, does anyone know of a good barber round here? And the next day I start all over again with the shortest one. But you said Sikhs didn't approve of cutting hair. I only do that with Europeans, he said. I stared at him. The man was stark raving barmy. I felt I would go barmy myself if I went on talking to him much longer. I edged towards the door. I think you're amazing, I said. You're quite brilliant. And don't worry about a thing. My lips are sealed. Thanks, old man, Uncle Savory said. Good lad. I flew out of the cabin and shut the door. And that is the story of Uncle Savory. You don't believe it? Listen, I could hardly believe it myself as I staggered upstairs to the bar. I kept my promise though. I told no one. Today it no longer matters. The man was at least 30 years older than me, so by now his soul is at rest and his wigs are probably being used by his nephews and nieces for playing charades. SS Manora. October 4th, 1938. Dear Mama. We're now in the Red Sea, and it is hot. The wind is behind us and going at exactly the same speed as the boat, so there is not a breath of air on board. 3 times they have turned the ship round against the wind to get some air into the cabins and into the engine room. Fans merely blow hot air into your face. The deck is strewn with a lot of limp wet things for all the world, like a lot of wet towels steaming over the kitchen boiler. They just smoke cigarettes and shout, "Boy, another iced lager." I don't feel the heat much, probably because I'm thin. In fact, as soon as I've finished this letter, I'm going off to have a vigorous game of deck tennis with another thin man, a government vet called Hammond. We play with our shirts off, throwing the quoit as hard as we can, and when we have to stop for fear of drowning in our own sweat, we just jump into the swimming bath. Dar es Salaam. The temperature in the shade was around 120 degrees Fahrenheit on board the SS Manora as she crept southwards down the Red Sea towards Port Sudan. The breeze was behind us and it blew at exactly the same speed as the ship. There was, therefore, no movement of air at all on board. 3 times during the first day they turned the ship around and sailed against the wind to blow some air through the portholes and over the decks. This made little difference, and even the sinewy sunburnt gophers and their tough bony little wives became silent and exhausted. Like me, they sprawled in deck chairs under the awning, gasping for breath while the sweat ran down their faces and necks and arms and dripped from their elbows onto the wooden deck. It was even too hot to read. During the second day in the Red Sea, the Manora passed very close to an Italian ship which, like us, was going south. She wasn't more than 200 yards away from us and her decks were crowded with women. There must have been several thousand of them all over the ship and not a man in sight. I couldn't believe my eyes. "What's going on?" I asked one of the ship's officers, who was standing near me on the rail. "Why all the girls?" "They're for the Italian soldiers," he said. "What Italian soldiers?" "The ones in Abyssinia," he said. "Mussolini is trying to conquer Abyssinia and he's got 100,000 troops in there. Now they are shipping out Italian girls to keep the soldiers happy." "You're pulling my leg." "They're going out in boatloads," the officer said. "1 girl for every soldier in the ranks, 2 for each colonel and 3 for a general." "Be serious," I said. "They really are for the soldiers," he said. "It is such a rotten, pointless war and the soldiers all hate it and they are fed up with massacring the wretched Abyssinians. So Mussolini is sending out thousands of girls to boost their morale." I waved to the girls on the other ship and about 2,000 of them waved back at me. They seemed very cheerful. Wondered how long they would be feeling that way. At last the Manora reached Mombasa, and there I was met by a man from the Shell Company who told me I was to proceed at once down the coast to Dar es Salaam, in Tanganyika, now Tanzania. "It will take you a day and a night to get there," he said, "and you travel on a little coastal vessel called the Dumra. Here's your ticket." I transferred to the Dumra and it sailed the same day. That evening we called in at Zanzibar, where the air was filled with the amazing spicy sweet scent of cloves, and I stood by the rail gazing at the old Arab town and thinking what a lucky young fellow I was to be seeing all these marvelous places free of charge and with a good job at the end of it all. We left Zanzibar at midnight and I went to bed in my tiny cabin knowing that tomorrow would be journey's end. When I woke up the next morning the ship's engines had stopped. I jumped out of my bunk and peered through the porthole. This was my first glimpse of Dar es Salaam and I have never forgotten it. We were anchored out in the middle of a vast rippling blue-black lagoon, and all around the rim of the lagoon there were pale yellow sandy beaches, almost white, and breakers were running up onto the sand, and coconut palms with their little green leafy hats were growing on the beaches, and there were casuarina trees, immensely tall and breathtakingly beautiful with their delicate gray-green foliage. And then behind the casuarinas was what seemed to me like a jungle, a great tangle of tremendous dark green trees that were full of shadows and almost certainly teeming, so I told myself, with rhinos and lions and all manner of vicious beasts. Over to one side lay the tiny town of Dar es Salaam, the houses white and yellow and pink, and among the houses I could see a narrow church steeple and a domed mosque, and along the waterfront there was a line of acacia trees splashed with scarlet flowers. A fleet of canoes was rowing out to take us ashore, and the black-skinned rowers were chanting weird songs in time with their rowing. The whole of that amazing tropical scene through the porthole has been photographed on my mind ever since. To me it was all wonderful, beautiful and exciting. And so it remained for the rest of my time in Tanganyika. I loved it all. There were no furled umbrellas, no bowler hats, no somber gray suits, and I never once had to get on a train or a bus. Only 3 young Englishmen ran the shell company in the whole of that vast territory, and I was the youngest and the junior. When we were not on the road, we lived in the splendid large shell company house perched on the top of the cliffs outside Dar es Salaam, and we were treated like princes. Our domestic staff consisted of a male native cook affectionately called Piggy because the Swahili for cook is Mpishi. There was a shamba boy or gardener called Salamu and a personal boy for each of us. Your boy was really a kind of valet and jack of all trades. He was expert at sewing and mending and washing and ironing and polishing and making sure there weren't scorpions in your mosquito boots before you put them on, and he became your friend. He looked after nobody else but you, and there was nothing he did not know about your life and your habits. In return, you looked after him and his wives, never less than 2, and his children who lived in their own quarters at the back of the house. My boy was called Mdisho. He was a Mwanamwezi tribesman, which meant a lot out there because the Mwanamwezi was the only tribe who had ever defeated the gigantic Maasai in battle. Mdisho was tall and graceful and soft-spoken, and his loyalty to me, his young white English master, was absolute. I hope, and I believe, that I was equally loyal to him. The first thing you had to do when you came to work in Dar es Salaam was to learn Swahili, otherwise you could not communicate either with your own boy or with any other native of the country because none of them spoke a word of English. In those benighted days of empire it was considered impertinent for a black man to understand English, let alone to speak it. The result was that none of them made any effort to learn our language, so we had to learn theirs instead. Swahili is a relatively simple language, and with the help of a Swahili-English dictionary and a grammar book, plus some hard work in the evenings, you could become pretty fluent in a couple of months. Then you took an exam, and if you passed it, the shell company gave you a bonus of £100, which was a lot of money in those days when a case of whiskey cost only £12. Sometimes I would have to go on safari upcountry, and Mdisho always came with me. We would take the shell station wagon and be gone for a month, driving all over Tanganyika on dirt roads that were covered with millions of tiny close-together ruts. Driving over those ruts in a station wagon felt as though you were riding on top of gigantic vibrator. We would drive far west to the edge of Lake Tanganyika in Central Africa and on down south to the borders of Nyasaland, and after that we would head east towards Mozambique, and the purpose of these trips was to visit our shell customers. These customers ran diamond mines and gold mines and sisal plantations and cotton plantations and goodness knows what else besides, and my job was to keep their machinery supplied with the proper grades of lubricating oil and fuel oil. Not a great deal of intelligence or imagination was required, but by gum you needed to be fit and tough. I loved that life. We saw giraffes standing unafraid right beside the road nibbling the tops of the trees. We saw plenty of elephant and hippo and zebra and antelope and very occasionally a pride of lions. The only creatures I was frightened of were the snakes. We used often to see a big one gliding across the dirt road ahead of the car, and the golden rule was never to accelerate and try to run it over, especially if the roof of the car was open, as ours often was. If you hit a snake at speed, the front wheel can flip it up into the air and there is a danger of it landing in your lap. I can think of nothing worse than that. The really bad snake in Tanganyika is the Black Mamba. It is the only one that has no fear of man and will deliberately attack him on sight. If it bites you, you are a goner. One morning I was shaving myself in the bathroom of our Dar es Salaam house, and as I lathered my face I was absent-mindedly gazing out of the window into the garden. I was watching Salaam, our Shamba boy, as he slowly and methodically raked the gravel on the front drive. Then I saw the snake. It was 6 feet long and thick as my arm and quite black. It was a mamba all right, and there was no doubt that it had seen Salaam and was gliding fast over the gravel straight towards him. I flung myself toward the open window and yelled in Swahili, Salaam. Salaam. Amalia Nyoka Kubwa. Nyuma Wiwi. UPC, in other words, Salaam. Salaam. Beware huge snake. Behind you. Quickly, quickly! The mamba was moving over the gravel at the speed of a running man, and when Salaam turned and saw it, it could not have been more than 15 paces away from him. There was nothing more I could do. There was not much Salaam could do either. He knew it was useless to run because a mamba at full speed could travel as fast as a galloping horse. And he certainly knew it was a mamba. Every native in Tanganyika knew what a mamba looked like and what to expect from it. It would reach him in another 5 seconds. I leant out of the window and held my breath. Salaam swung round and faced the snake. I saw him go into a crouch. He crouched very low with one leg behind the other like a runner about to start a 100-yard sprint, and he was holding the long rake out in front of him. He raised it, but no higher than his shoulder, and he stood there for those long 4 or 5 seconds absolutely motionless, watching the great black deadly snake as it glided so quickly over the gravel towards him. Its small triangular snake's head was raised up in the air, and I could hear the soft rustling of the gravel as the body slid over the loose stones. I have the whole nightmarish picture of that scene still before my eyes, the morning sunshine on the garden, the massive baobab tree in the background, Salaam in his old khaki shorts and shirt and bare feet standing brave and absolutely still with the upraised rake in his hands, and to one side the long black snake gliding over the gravel straight towards him with its small poisonous head held high and ready to strike. Salaam waited. He never moved or made a sound during the time it took the snake to reach him. He waited until the very last moment when the mamba was not more than 5 feet away, and then wham! Salaam struck first. He brought the metal prongs of the rake down hard right onto the middle of the mamba's back, and he held the rake there with all his weight, leaning forward now and jumping up and down to put more weight on the fork in an effort to pin the snake to the ground. I saw the blood spurt where the prongs had gone right into the snake's body, and then I rushed downstairs absolutely naked, grabbing a golf club as I went through the hall, and outside on the drive Salaam was still there pressing with both hands on the rake, and the great snake was writhing and twisting and throwing itself about, and I shouted to Salaam in Swahili, "What shall I do?" "It is all right now, Bwana," he shouted back. "I have broken its back and it cannot travel forward any more. Stand away, Bwana. Stand well away and leave it to me." Salaam lifted the rake and jumped away, and the snake went on writhing and twisting, but it was quite unable to travel in any direction. The boy went forward and hit it accurately and very hard on the head with the metal end of the rake, and suddenly the snake stopped moving. Salaam let out a great sigh and passed a hand over his forehead. Then he looked at me and smiled. "Asante, Bwana," he said, "Asante sana," which simply means, "Thank you, Bwana." Thank you very much. It isn't often one gets the chance to save a person's life. It gave me a good feeling for the rest of the day, and from then on, every time I saw Salaam, the good feeling would come back to me. Dar es Salaam. March 19, 1939. Dear Mama. If a war breaks out, you've jolly well got to go to Tendi, otherwise you'll be bombed. Don't forget, you've got to go if war breaks out. Simba. About a month after the Black Mamba incident, I set out on a safari upcountry in the old Shell station wagon with Ndisho, and our first stop was the small town of Bagamoyo. I mention this only because the name of the Indian trader I had to go and see in Bagamoyo was so wonderful I have never been able to get it out of my mind. He was a tiny little man with an immense low-slung protuberant belly of the kind that women have when they are 8.5 months pregnant, and he carried this great ball in front of him very proudly, as if it were a special medal or a coat of arms. He called himself Mr. Shankarbai Gandarbai, and across the top of his business notepaper was printed in red capital letters the full title he had conferred upon himself, Mr. Shankarbai Gandarbai of Bagamoyo, seller of decorticators. A decorticator is a huge clanking piece of machinery that converts the leaves of the sisal plant into fibers for making rope, and if you wanted to buy one, the man to go and see was Mr. Shankarbai Gandarbai of Bagamoyo. After 3 more days of dusty traveling and visiting customers, Disho and I came to the town of Tabora. Tabora is some 450 miles inland from Dar es Salaam, and in 1939 it was not much of a town, just a scattering of houses and a few streets where the Indian traders had their shops. But because by Tanganyikan standards it was a sizable place, it was honored by the presence of a British district officer. The district officers in Tanganyika were a breed I admired. Admittedly they were sunburnt and sinewy, but they were not gophers. They were all university graduates with good degrees, and in their lonely outposts they had to be all things to all men. They were the judges whose decisions settled both tribal and personal disputes. They were the advisors to tribal chiefs. They were often the givers of medicines and the saviors of the sick. They administered their own vast districts by keeping law and order under the most difficult circumstances. And wherever there was a district officer, the shellman on safari was welcome to stay the night at his house. The D.O. in Tabora was called Robert Sanford, a man in his early 30s who had a wife and 3 very small children, a boy of 6, a girl of 4 and a baby. That evening I was sitting on the veranda having a sundowner with Robert Sanford and his wife Mary, while 2 of the children were playing out on the grass in front of the house under the watchful eye of their black nurse. The heat of the day was becoming less intense as the sun went down, and the first whiskey and soda was tasting good. "So what's been going on in Dar?" Robert Sanford asked me. "Anything exciting?" I told him about the Black Mamba and Salaam. When I had finished, Mary Sanford said, "That's the one thing I'm always frightened of in this country, those beastly snakes." "Damn lucky you happened to see it behind him," Robert Sanford said. "He was certain to have been killed." "We had a spitting cobra near our back door not long ago," Mary Sanford said. Robert shot it. The Sanford house was on a hill outside the town. It was a white wooden 2-story building with a roof of green tiles. The eaves of the house projected far out beyond the walls to provide extra shade, and this gave the building a sort of Japanese pagoda appearance. The surrounding countryside was to me a very pleasant sight. It was a vast brown plain with many quite large knolls and hummocks dotted all over it, and although the plain itself was mostly burned-up scrubland, the hills were covered with all sorts of huge jungle trees, and their dense foliage made little emerald green dots all over the plain. On the burned-up plain itself there grew nothing but those bare spiky thorn trees that you find all over East Africa, and there were about 6 huge vultures sitting quite motionless on every thorn tree in sight. The vultures were brown with curved orange beaks and orange feet, and they spent their whole lives sitting and watching and waiting for some animal to die so they could pick its bones. "Do you like this sort of life?" I said to Robert Sanford. "I love the freedom," he said. "I administer about 2,000 square miles of territory and I can go where I want and do more or less exactly as I please. That part of it is marvelous. But I do miss the company of other white men. There aren't many even moderately intelligent Europeans in the town." We sat there watching the sun go down behind the flat brown plain that was covered with thorn trees, and we could see the sinister vultures waiting like feathered undertakers for death to come along and give them something to work on. "Keep the children a bit closer to the house, Mary," Sanford called out to the nurse. "Bring them closer, please." Robert Sanford said, "My mother sent me out Beethoven's Third Symphony from England last week. HMV, 2 records, 4 sides and all, Toscanini conducting. I'm using a thorn needle instead of a steel one so as not to wear out the grooves. It seems to work. Don't you find the records warp a lot out here? I asked. I keep them lying flat with a pile of books on top of them, he said. What I'm terrified of is dropping one and breaking it. The sun had gone down now and a lovely soft light was spreading over the landscape. I could see a group of zebra grazing among the thorn trees about half a mile away. Robert Sanford was also watching the zebras. I keep wondering, he said, if it wouldn't be possible to catch a young zebra and break it in for riding, just like a horse. After all, they are only wild horses with stripes on. Has anyone ever tried? I asked. Not that I know, he said. Mary's a good rider. What do you think, darling? How would you like to have a private zebra to ride on? It might be fun, she said. Even though she had a bit of a jaw, she was a handsome woman. I didn't mind the jaw. The shape of it gave her the look of a fighter. Perhaps we could cross one with a horse, Robert Sanford said, and call it a zorse. Or a hebra, Mary Sanford said. Right, her husband said, smiling. Shall we try it? Mary Sanford said. It would be rather splendid to have a baby zorse or hebra. Oh darling, shall we try it? The children could ride it, he said. A black zorse with white stripes all over it. Please can we play your Beethoven after supper? I said. Absolutely, Robert Sanford said. I'll put the gramophone out here on the veranda and then those Simba tremendous chords can go booming out through the night over the plain. It's terrific, the only trouble is I have to wind the thing up twice for each side. I'll wind it for you, I said. Suddenly, the voice of a man yelling in Swahili exploded into the quiet of the evening. It was my boy, Mdisho. Bwana! Bwana! Bwana, he was yelling from somewhere behind the house. Simba, Bwana! Simba! Simba! Simba is Swahili for lion. All 3 of us leapt to our feet, and the next moment Mdisho came tearing round the corner of the house yelling at us in Swahili, Come quick, Bwana! Come quick! Come quick! A huge lion is eating the wife of the cook. That sounds pretty funny when you put it on paper back here in England, but to us, standing on a veranda in the middle of East Africa, it was not funny at all. Robert Sanford flew into the house and came out again in 5 seconds flat holding a powerful rifle and ramming a cartridge into the breech. Get those children indoors! He shouted to his wife as he ran down off the veranda with me behind him. Mdisho was dancing about and pointing towards the back of the house and yelling in Swahili, the lion has taken the wife of the cook and the lion is eating her and the cook is chasing the lion and trying to save his wife. The servants lived in a series of low whitewashed-out buildings at the back of the house, and as we came running round the corner we saw 4 or 5 houseboys leaping about and pointing and shrieking, Simba! 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 The boys were all clothed in spotless white cotton robes that looked like long nightshirts, and each had a fine scarlet tarbush on his head. The tarbush is a sort of top hat without a brim, and there is often a black tassel on it. The women had come out of their huts as well and were standing in a separate group, silent, immobile and staring. Where is it? Robert Sanford shouted, but he had no need to ask, for we very quickly spotted the massive sandy-colored lion not more than 80 or 90 yards off and trotting away from the house. He had a fine bushy collar of fur around his neck, and in his jaws he was holding the wife of the cook. The lion had the woman by the waist so that her head and arms hung down on one side and her legs on the other, and I could see that she was wearing a red and white spotted dress. The lion, so startlingly close, was loping away from us in the calmest possible manner with a slow, long-striding, springy lope, and behind the lion, not more than the length of a tennis court behind, ran the cook himself in his white cotton robe and with his red hat on his head, running most bravely and waving his arms like a whirlwind, leaping, clapping his hands, screaming, shouting, Simba! 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 Let go of my wife! Let go of my wife! Oh, it was a scene of great tragedy and comedy both mixed up together, and now Robert Sanford was running full speed after the cook who was running after the lion. He was holding his rifle in both hands and shouting to the cook, "Pingo! Pingo! Get out of the way, Pingo! Lie down on the ground so I can shoot the Simba. You are in my way. You are in my way, Pingo!" But the cook ignored him and kept on running, and the lion ignored everybody, not altering his pace at all but continuing to lope along with slow springy strides and with the head held high and carrying the woman proudly in his jaws, rather like a dog who is trotting off with a good bone. Both the cook and Robert Sanford were traveling faster than the lion, who really didn't seem to care about his pursuers at all. And as for me, I didn't know what to do to help them, so I ran after Robert Sanford. It was an awkward situation because there was no way that Robert Sanford could take a shot at the lion without risking a hit on the cook's wife, let alone on the cook himself, who was still right in his line of fire. The lion was heading for one of those hillocks that was densely covered with jungle trees, and we all knew that once he got in there, we would never be able to get at him. The incredibly brave cook was actually catching up on the lion and was now not more than 10 yards behind him, and Robert Sanford was 30 or 40 yards behind the cook. "Aye!" the cook was shouting. "Simba! Simba! Simba! Let go my wife! I am coming after you, Simba!" Then Robert Sanford stopped and raised his rifle and took aim, and I thought surely he is not risking a shot at a moving lion when it's got a woman in its jaws. There was an almighty crack as the big gun went off, and I saw a spurt of dust just ahead of the lion. The lion stopped dead and turned his head, still holding the woman in his jaws. He saw the arm-waving shouting cook, and he saw Robert Sanford, and he saw me, and he had certainly heard the rifle shot and seen the spurt of dust. He must have thought an army was coming after him because instantaneously he dropped the cook's wife onto the ground and broke for cover. I have never seen anything accelerate so fast from a standing start. With great leaping bounding strides he was in among the jungle trees on the hillock before Robert Sanford could ram another cartridge into his gun. The cook reached the wife first, then Robert Sanford, then me. I couldn't believe what I saw. I was certain that the grip of those terrible jaws would have ripped the woman's waist and stomach almost in two, but there she was sitting up on the ground and smiling at the cook, her husband. "Where are you hurt?" shouted Robert Sanford, rushing up. The cook's wife looked up at him and kept smiling. And she said in Swahili, "That old lion, he couldn't scare me. I just lay there in his mouth pretending I was dead, and he didn't even bite through my clothes." She stood up and smoothed down her red and white spotted dress, which was wet with the lion's saliva, and the cook embraced her, and the two of them did a little dance of joy in the twilight out there on the great brown African plain. Robert Sanford just stood there gaping at the cook's wife. "So, for that matter, did I. Are you absolutely sure the Simba didn't hurt you?" he asked her. "Did not his teeth go into your body?" "No, Bwana," the woman said, laughing. "He carried me as gently as if I had been one of his own cubs. But now I shall have to wash my dress." We walked slowly back to the group of astonished onlookers. "Tonight," Robert Sanford said, addressing them all, "nobody is to go far from the house, you understand me?" "Yes, Bwana," they said. Yes, we understand you. That old Simba is hiding over there in the wood, and he may come back," Robert Sanford said. "So be very careful. And Pingo, please continue to cook our dinner. I am getting hungry." The cook ran into the kitchen, clapping his hands and leaping for joy. We walked over to where Mary Sanford was standing. She had come round to the back of the house soon after us and had witnessed the whole scene. The three of us then returned to the veranda and fresh drinks were poured. Dar es Salaam. June 5, 1939. Dear Mama. It's pleasant lying back and listening to and at the same time watching the antics of Hitler and Mussolini, who are invariably on the ceiling catching flies and mosquitoes. Hitler and Mussolini are two lizards which live in our sitting room. They're always here, and apart from being very useful about the house, they are exciting to watch. You can see Hitler, who is smaller than Musso and not so fat, fixing his unfortunate victim, often a small moth, with a very hypnotic psyche. The moth, terrified, stays stock still, then suddenly, so quickly that you can hardly see the movement at all, he darts his neck forward, shoots out a long tongue, and that's the end of the moth. They're quite small, only about 10 inches long, and they've taken on the color of the walls and ceiling, which are yellow and become quite transparent. You can see their appendixes, at least we think we can. I don't believe anything like this has ever happened before, Robert Sanford said as he sat down once again in his cane armchair. There was a little round slot in one of the arms of the chair to carry his glass, and he put the whiskey and soda carefully into it. In the first place, he went on, lions do not attack people around here unless you go near their cubs. They can get all the food they want. There's plenty of game on the plain. Perhaps he's got a family in that patch of wood on the hill, Mary Sanford said. That could be, Robert Sanford said. But if he had thought the woman was threatening his family, he would have killed her on the spot. Instead of that, he carries her off as soft and gentle as a good gun dog with a partridge. If you want my opinion, I do not believe he ever meant to hurt her. We sat there sipping our drinks and trying to find some sort of an explanation for the astonishing behavior of the lion. Normally, Robert Sanford said, I would get together a bunch of hunters first thing tomorrow morning and we'd flush out that old lion and kill him. But I don't want to do it. He doesn't deserve it. In fact, I'm not going to do it. Good for you, darling, his wife said. The story of this strange happening with the lion spread in the end all over East Africa, and it became a bit of a legend. And when I got back to Dar es Salaam about 2 weeks later, there was a letter waiting for me from the East African Standard, I think it was called, up in Nairobi, asking if I would write my own eyewitness description of the incident. This I did, and in time I received a check for £5 from the newspaper for my first published work. There followed a long correspondence in the columns of the paper from the white hunters and other experts all over Uganda, Kenya and Tanganyika, each offering his or her different and often bizarre explanation. But none of them made any sense. The matter has remained a mystery ever since. The Green Mamba. Oh, those snakes! How I hated them! They were the only fearful thing about Tanganyika, and a newcomer very quickly learned to identify most of them and to know which were deadly and which were simply poisonous. The killers, apart from the Black Mambas, were the Green Mambas, the cobras and the tiny little puff adders that looked very much like small sticks lying motionless in the middle of a dusty path, and so easy to step on. One Sunday evening I was invited to go and have a sundowner at the house of an Englishman called Fuller who worked in the customs office in Dar es Salaam. He lived with his wife and 2 small children in a plain white wooden house that stood alone some way back from the road in a rough grassy piece of ground with coconut trees scattered about. I was walking across the grass towards the house and was about 20 yards away when I saw a large green snake go gliding straight up the veranda steps of Fuller's house and in through the open front door. The brilliant yellowy-green skin and its great size made me certain it was a green mamba, a creature almost as deadly as the black mamba, and for a few seconds I was so startled and dumbfounded and horrified that I froze to the spot. Then I pulled myself together and ran round to the back of the house shouting, "Mr. Fuller! Mr. Fuller!" Mrs. Fuller popped her head out of an upstairs window. "What on earth's the matter?" she said. "You've got a large green mamba in your front room." I shouted. I saw it go up the veranda steps and right in through the door. Fred! Mrs. Fuller shouted, turning round. Fred! Come here! Freddie Fuller's round red face appeared at the window beside his wife. What's up? He asked. There's a green mamba in your living room. I shouted. Without hesitation and without wasting time with more questions, he said to me, "Stay there. I'm going to lower the children down to you one at a time." He was completely cool and unruffled. He didn't even raise his voice. A small girl was lowered down to me by her wrists and I was able to catch her easily by the legs. Then came a small boy. Then Freddie Fuller lowered his wife and I caught her by the waist and put her on the ground. Then came Fuller himself. He hung by his hands from the windowsill and when he let go he landed neatly on his 2 feet. We stood in a little group on the grass at the back of the house and I told Fuller exactly what I had seen. The mother was holding the 2 children by the hand, one on each side of her. They didn't seem to be particularly alarmed. What happens now? I asked. Go down to the road, all of you, Fuller said. I'm off to fetch the snake man. He trotted away and got into his small ancient black car and drove off. Mrs. Fuller and the 2 small children and I went down to the road and sat in the shade of a large mango tree. Who is this snake man? I asked Mrs. Fuller. He is an old Englishman who has been out here for years, Mrs. Fuller said. He actually likes snakes. He understands them and never kills them. He catches them and sells them to zoos and laboratories all over the world. Every native for miles around knows about him and whenever one of them sees a snake, he marks its hiding place and runs, often for great distances, to tell the snake man. Then the snake man comes along and captures it. The snake man's strict rule is that he will never buy a captured snake from the natives. Why not? I asked. To discourage them from trying to catch snakes themselves, Mrs. Fuller said. In his early days he used to buy caught snakes, but so many natives got bitten trying to catch them and so many died that he decided to put a stop to it. Now any native who brings in a caught snake, no matter how rare, gets turned away. That's good, I said. What is the snake man's name? I asked. Donald McFarlane, she said. I believe he's Scottish. Is the snake in the house, Mummy? The small girl asked. Yes, darling. But the snake man is going to get it out. He'll bite Jack, the girl said. Oh, my God! Mrs. Fuller cried, jumping to her feet. I forgot about Jack. She began calling out, Jack! Come here, Jack! 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 The children jumped up as well and all of them started calling to the dog. But no dog came out of the open front door. He's bitten Jack, the small girl cried out. He must have bitten him. She began to cry and so did her brother who was a year or so younger than she was. Mrs. Fuller looked grim. Jack's probably hiding upstairs, she said. You know how clever he is. Mrs. Fuller and I seated ourselves again on the grass, where the children remained standing. In between their tears they went on calling to the dog. Would you like me to take you down to the Maddens' house? Their mother asked. No, they cried. No, no, no. We want Jack. Here's Daddy. Mrs. Fuller cried, pointing at the tiny black car coming up the road in a swirl of dust. I noticed a long wooden pole sticking out through one of the car windows. The children ran to meet the car. Jack's inside the house and he's been bitten by the snake, they wailed. We know he's been bitten. He doesn't come when we call him. Mr. Fuller and the snake man got out of the car. The snake man was small and very old, probably over 70. He wore leather boots made of thick cowhide and he had long gauntlet-type gloves on his hands made of the same stuff. The gloves reached above his elbows. In his right hand he carried an extraordinary implement, an 8-foot-long wooden pole with a forked end. The 2 prongs of the fork were made, so it seemed, of black rubber, about an inch thick and quite flexible, and it was clear that if the fork was pressed against the ground the 2 prongs would bend outwards, allowing the neck of the fork to go down as close to the ground as necessary. In his left hand he carried an ordinary brown sack. Donald McFarlane, the snake man, may have been old and small, but he was an impressive-looking character. His eyes were pale blue, deep-set in a face round and dark and wrinkled as a walnut. Above the blue eyes, the eyebrows were thick and startlingly white, but the hair on his head was almost black. In spite of the thick leather boots, he moved like a leopard, with soft slow cat-like strides, and he came straight up to me and said, "Who are you?" "He's with Shell," Fuller said. "He hasn't been here long." "You want to watch," the snake man said to me. "Watch?" I said, wavering. "Watch? How do you mean watch?" "I mean where from?" "Not in the house?" "You can stand out on the veranda and look through the window," the snake man said. "Come on," Fuller said. "We'll both watch." "Now don't do anything silly," Mrs. Fuller said. The 2 children stood there forlorn and miserable, with tears all over their cheeks. The snake man and Fuller and I walked over the grass towards the house, and as we approached the veranda steps the snake man whispered, "Tread softly on the wooden boards or he'll pick up the vibration. Wait until I've gone in, then walk up quietly and stand by the window." The snake man went up the steps first and he made absolutely no sound at all with his feet. He moved soft and cat-like onto the veranda and straight through the front door, and then he quickly but very quietly closed the door behind him. I felt better with the door closed. What I mean is I felt better for myself. I certainly didn't feel better for the snake man. I figured he was committing suicide. I followed Fuller onto the veranda and we both crept over to the window. The window was open, but it had a fine mesh mosquito netting all over it. That made me feel better still. We peered through the netting. The living room was simple and ordinary, coconut matting on the floor, a red sofa, a coffee table and a couple of armchairs. The dog was sprawled on the matting under the coffee table, a large Airedale with curly brown and black hair. He was stone dead. The snake man was standing absolutely still just inside the door of the living room. The brown sack was now slung over his left shoulder and he was grasping the long pole with both hands, holding it out in front of him, parallel to the ground. I couldn't see the snake. I didn't think the snake man had seen it yet either. A minute went by, 2 minutes. 5. Nobody moved. There was death in that room. The air was heavy with death and the snake man stood as motionless as a pillar of stone, with the long rod held out in front of him. And still he waited. Another minute, and another. And another. And now I saw the snake man beginning to bend his knees. Very slowly he bent his knees until he was almost squatting on the floor, and from that position he tried to peer under the sofa and the armchairs. And still it didn't look as though he was seeing anything. Slowly he straightened his legs again, and then his head began to swivel around the room. Over to the right, in the far corner, a staircase led up to the floor above. The snake man looked at the stairs, and I knew very well what was going through his head. Quite abruptly, he took one step forward and stopped. Nothing happened. A moment later I caught sight of the snake. It was lying full length along the skirting of the right-hand wall, but hidden from the snake man's view by the back of the 3, 4, 5. Nobody moved. There was death in that room. The air was heavy with death and the snake man stood as motionless as a pillar of stone, with the long rod held out in front of him. And still he waited. Another minute, and another. And another. And now I saw the snake man beginning to bend his knees. Very slowly he bent his knees until he was almost squatting on the floor, and from that position he tried to peer under the sofa and the armchairs. And still it didn't look as though he was seeing anything. Slowly he straightened his legs again, and then his head began to swivel around the room. Over to the right, in the far corner, a staircase led up to the floor above. The snake man looked at the stairs, and I knew very well what was going through his head. Quite abruptly, he took one step forward and stopped. Nothing happened. A moment later I caught sight of the snake. It was lying full length along the skirting of the right-hand wall, but hidden from the snake man's view by the back of the sofa. It lay there like a long, beautiful, deadly shaft of green glass, quite motionless, perhaps asleep. It was facing away from us who were at the window, with its small triangular head resting on the matting near the foot of the stairs. I nudged Fuller and whispered, "It's over there against the wall." I pointed and Fuller saw the snake. At once, he started waving both hands, palms outward, back and forth across the window hoping to get the snake man's attention. The snake man didn't see him. Very softly, Fuller said, "PSSST," and the snake man looked up sharply. Fuller pointed. The snake man understood and gave a nod. Now the snake man began working his way very, very slowly to the back wall of the room so as to get a view of the snake behind the sofa. He never walked on his toes as you or I would have done. His feet remained flat on the ground all the time. The cowhide boots were like moccasins, with neither soles nor heels. Gradually, he worked his way over to the back wall, and from there he was able to see at least the head and 2 or 3 feet of the snake itself. But the snake also saw him. With a movement so fast it was invisible, the snake's head came up about 2 feet off the floor and the front of the body arched backwards, ready to strike. Almost simultaneously, it bunched its whole body into a series of curves, ready to flash forward. The snake man was just a bit too far away from the snake to reach it with the end of his pole. He waited, staring at the snake, and the snake stared back at him with 2 small malevolent black eyes. Then the snake man started speaking to the snake. "Come along, my pretty," he whispered in a soft wheedling voice. "There's a good boy. Nobody's going to hurt you. Nobody's going to harm you, my pretty little thing. Just lie still and relax." He took a step forward towards the snake, holding the pole out in front of him. What the snake did next was so fast that the whole movement couldn't have taken more than 1/100th of a second, like the flick of a camera shutter. There was a green flash as the snake darted forward at least 10 feet and struck at the snake man's leg. Nobody could have got out of the way of that one. I heard the snake's head strike against the thick cowhide boot with a sharp little crack, and then at once the head was back in that same deadly backward curving position, ready to strike again. "There's a good boy," the snake man said softly. "There's a clever boy. There's a lovely fellow. You mustn't get excited. Keep calm and everything's going to be all right." As he was speaking, he was slowly lowering the end of the pole until the forked prongs were about 12 inches above the middle of the snake's body. "There's a lovely fellow," he whispered. "There's a good kind little chap. Keep still now, my beauty. Keep still, my pretty. Keep quite still. Daddy's not going to hurt you." I could see a thin dark trickle of venom running down the snake man's right boot where the snake had struck. The snake, head raised and arcing backwards, was as tense as a tight wound spring and ready to strike again. "Keep still, my lovely," the snake man whispered. "Don't move now. Keep still. No one's going to hurt you." Then wham, the rubber prongs came down right across the snake's body, about midway along its length, and pinned it to the floor. All I could see was a green blur as the snake thrashed around furiously in an effort to free itself. But the snake man kept up the pressure on the prongs and the snake was trapped. What happens next? I wondered. There was no way he could catch hold of that madly twisting, flailing length of green muscle with his hands, and even if he could have done so, the head would surely have flashed around and bitten him in the face. Holding the very end of the 8-foot pole, the snake man began to work his way round the room until he was at the tail end of the snake. Then, in spite of the flailing and the thrashing, he started pushing the prongs forward along the snake's body towards the head. Very, very slowly he did it, pushing the rubber prongs forward over the snake's flailing body, keeping the snake pinned down all the time and pushing the long wooden rod forward millimeter by millimeter. It was a fascinating and frightening thing to watch, the little man with white eyebrows and black hair carefully manipulating his long implement and sliding the fork ever so slowly along the length of the twisting snake towards the head. The snake's body was thumping against the coconut matting with such a noise that if you had been upstairs you might have thought two big men were wrestling on the floor. Then at last the prongs were right behind the head itself, pinning it down, and at that point the snake man reached forward with one gloved hand and grasped the snake very firmly by the neck. He threw away the pole. He took the sack off his shoulder with his free hand. He lifted the great still twisting length of the deadly green snake and pushed the head into the sack. Then he let go the head and bundled the rest of the creature in and closed the sack. The sack started jumping about as though there were 50 angry rats inside it, but the snake man was now totally relaxed and he held the sack casually in one hand as if it contained no more than a few pounds of potatoes. He stooped and picked up his pole from the floor, then he turned and looked towards the window where we were peering in. "Pity about the dog," he said. "You'd better get it out of the way before the children see it." The beginning of the war. Breakfast in Dar es Salaam never varied. It was always a delicious ripe pawpaw picked that morning in the garden by the cook, onto which was squeezed the juice of a whole fresh lime. Just about every white man and woman in Tanganyika had pawpaw and lime juice for breakfast, and I believe those old colonials knew what was good for them. It is the healthiest and most refreshing breakfast I know. On a morning towards the end of August 1939, I was breakfasting on my pawpaw and thinking a great deal, like everyone else, about the war that we all knew was very soon going to break out with Germany. Disho was moving around the room and pretending to be busy. "Did you know there is going to be a war before very long?" I asked him. "A war?" he cried, perking up immediately. "A real war, Bwana?" "An enormous war," I said, and Disho's face was now alight with excitement. He was of the Mwanamwezi tribe, and there wasn't a Mwanamwezi anywhere who did not have fighting in his blood. For hundreds of years they had been the greatest warriors in East Africa, conquering all before them, including the Maasai, and even now the mere mention of war caused such dreams of glory in Disho's mind that he could hardly stand it. "I still have my father's weapons in my hut," he cried. "Shall get the spear out and start sharpening it immediately. Who are we going to fight, Bwana?" "The Germani," I said. "Good," he said. "There are plenty of Germani around here for us to kill." Disho was right about there being plenty of them. Only 25 years ago, before the First World War, Tanganyika had been German East Africa. But in 1919, after the armistice, Germany had been forced to hand the territory over to the British, who renamed it Tanganyika. Many Germans had stayed on and the country was still full of them. They owned diamond mines and gold mines. They grew sisal and cotton and tea and ground nuts. The owner of the soda water bottling plant in Dar es Salaam was a German, and so was Willy Hink, the watchmaker. In fact, the Germans greatly outnumbered all the other Europeans in Tanganyika put together, and when war broke out, as we now knew it must, they could present a dangerous and difficult problem to the authorities. "When is this enormous war going to begin?" Disho asked me. "They say quite soon," I told him, "because over in Europe, which is 10 times as far away as from here to Kilimanjaro, the Germans have a leader called Bwana Hitler who wishes to conquer the world. The Germans think this Bwana Hitler is a wonderful fellow. But he is actually a raving mad maniac. As soon as the war begins, the Germani will try to kill us all, and then, of course, we shall have to try to kill them before they can kill us. Disho, being a true child of his tribe, understood the principle of war very well. "Why don't we strike first?" he said, excitedly. "Why don't we take them by surprise, these Germani out here, Bwana? Why don't we kill all of them before the war begins? That is always the best way, Bwana. My ancestors always used to strike first." "I am afraid we have very strict rules about war," I said. "With us, nobody is allowed to kill anyone until the whistle blows and the game is officially started." "But that is ridiculous, Bwana," he cried. "In a war there are no rules. Winning is all that counts." Disho was only 19 years old. He had been born and brought up 700 miles inland from Dar es Salaam, near a place called Kigoma, on the shores of Lake Tanganyika, and both his parents had died before he was 12 years old. He had then been taken into the household of a kindly district officer in Kigoma and given the job of assistant shamba boy or gardener. From there he had graduated into the household as a houseboy and had charmed everybody by his good manners and gentle bearing. When the district officer had been moved back to the secretariat in Dar es Salaam, the family had taken Disho with them. A year or so later, the Dio had been transferred to Egypt and poor Disho was suddenly without a job or a home, but he did have in his possession one very valuable document, a splendid reference from his former employer. That was when I was lucky enough to find him and take him on. I made him my personal boy and soon the two of us had formed a friendship that I found rather marvelous. Disho could neither read nor write, and it was impossible for him to imagine that the world extended much beyond the shores of the African continent. But he was undoubtedly intelligent and quick to learn, and I had begun to teach him how to read. Every weekday, as soon as I got home from the office, we would have 3/4 of an hour of reading. He learnt fast, and although we were still on single words, we would soon be progressing to short sentences. I insisted on teaching him how to read and write not only Swahili words but also their English equivalents, so that he would learn a little basic English at the same time. He loved his lessons, and it was touching to see him already seated at the table in the dining room with his exercise book open in front of him when I came home in the evenings. Disho was about 6 feet tall, superbly built, with a rather scrunched-up flat-nosed face and the most beautiful pure white absolutely even teeth I had ever seen. "It is most important to obey the rules of war," I told him. "No Germani can be killed until war has been properly declared. And even then the enemy must be given the chance to surrender before you kill him." "How will we know when war is declared?" Disho asked me. "They will tell us on the wireless from England," I said. "We shall all know within a few seconds." And then the fun will begin," he cried, clapping his hands. "Oh Bwana, I can hardly wait for that time to come." "If you want to fight, you must become a soldier first," El told him. "You will have to join the Kenya regiment and become an askari." An askari was a soldier in the King's African Rifles, the KAR. "The askaris have guns and I don't know how to use a gun," he said. "They will teach you," I said. "You might enjoy it." That would be a very serious step for me to take. "Bwana," he said. "I shall have to give it a great deal of thought." A few days after that, things started hotting up in Dar es Salaam. War was clearly imminent, and elaborate plans. Dar es Salaam. Sunday, no date. Dear Mama, last week I finally succumbed to malaria and went to bed on Wednesday night with the most terrific head and a temp of 103 degrees. Next day it was 104 degrees and on Friday 105 degrees. They've got some marvelous new stuff called Adabrin which they straightway inject into your bottom in vast quantities which suddenly brings the temperature down, then they give you an injection of 15 or 20 grams of quinine and by that time you haven't got any bottom left at all, one side's just Adabrin and the other's quinine. I suppose that by the time you get this letter war will either be declared or it'll be off, but at the moment things, even here, are humming a bit. We're all temporary army officers, with batons, belts and all sorts of secret instructions. If we go out of the house, we've got to leave word where we've gone to so that we can be called at a moment's notice. We know exactly where to go if anything happens, but everything's very secret, and as I'm not sure whether our letters are being censored or not, I'm not going to tell you anymore. But if war breaks out, it'll be our job to round up all the Germans here, and after that things ought to be pretty quiet. We're made to round up the hundreds of Germans in Dar es Salaam and upcountry as soon as war was declared. There were not a lot of young Englishmen in Dar, perhaps 15 or 20 at the most, and all of us were ordered to leave our jobs and to become, by some magic process, temporary army officers. I was given a red armband and a platoon of Askaris to command, but never having been a soldier in my life, except at school, I felt rather at a loss with 25 highly trained troops with rifles and 1 machine gun in my charge. I was summoned to the army barracks in Dar es Salaam, where a British captain in the KAR gave me my orders. He was seated at a wooden table with his hat on in a swelteringly hot tin hut, and he had a little clipped brown mustache that kept jumping about when he spoke. As soon as war is declared, he said, all male Germans must be rounded up at the point of a gun and put into the prison camp. The prison camp is ready, and the Germans know it is ready, so many of them will try to escape from the country before we can catch them. The nearest neutral. Dar es Salaam. Friday, September 15th. Dear Mama, I'm very sorry I haven't written to you for such ages, but you can guess that things have been humming a bit here. Now all the Germans in the territory, and it's a pretty big place in which to try to catch them, have been safely put inside an internment camp. And we army officers were the people who had to collect them. The moment that war broke out at about 1:15 p.m. on Sunday, the alarm was given on a series of telephones, and certain key men dashed round and collected their squads, and proceeded to the police lines to be armed and to receive orders. At the time, I was actually out guarding the road going down the south coast to Kilwa and Lindi with native troops, Askaris, and a blockade across the road. All I heard was a grim voice down the field telephone which said, "War has been declared. Stand by. Arrest all Germans attempting to leave or enter the town." Then the fun started. I better not say any more or the censor might hold up the letter. Territory is Portuguese East Africa, and there is only one road running there from Dar es Salaam, the coast road going south. Do you know it? I told him I knew it very well. Down that road, the captain said, every German in Dar es Salaam will try to run the moment war is declared. It will be your duty to stop them and round them up and bring them back to the prison camp. Who, me? I cried, aghast. You and your platoon, he said. We can't spare any more men. We've got the entire country to cover. Make sure you take up a sensible defensive position and deploy your troops under good cover. Some of those Germans may try to shoot their way out. You mean, I said, that just me and my platoon are going to try to stop every German in Dar? Those are your orders, he said. But there must be hundreds of them. There are, he said, smirking a bit. What happens if they do have guns and put up a fight? I asked. Mow them down, the captain said. You've got a machine gun, haven't you? One machine gun can defeat Sioux men with rifles. I was getting nervous. I didn't want to be the person who gave the order to mow down Sioux civilians out there on the dusty coast road that led to Portuguese East Africa. What happens if they've got their women and children with them? I asked. You'll have to use your discretion, the captain said, evading the issue. But, I stammered, that road is the most important escape route in the whole country. Don't you think that you or some other regular officer should be doing this job? We've all got our hands full, the captain said. I tried once more. I am really not trained for this sort of thing, I said. I'm just a chap who works for Shell. Rubbish, he barked. Off you go now. And don't let us down. So off I went. I found a telephone and called Mdisho at the house to tell him not to expect me back until he saw me. I know where you are going, Bwana, he shouted down the phone. You are going after the Germani. Am I right? Well, I said, we'll see. Let me come with you, Bwana, he cried. Oh, please let me come with you. I'm afraid that's not possible this time, Mdisho, I said. You'll just have to stay and look after the house. Be careful, Bwana, he said. You will be careful they do not kill you. I went out into the Barak square where my platoon was waiting for me. The Askaris looked very smart in their khaki shorts and shirts, and they were lined up at attention beside two open trucks with their rifles at their sides. As soon as I arrived, the sergeant saluted me and told the men to get into the trucks. I sat in the cabin of the front truck between the driver and the sergeant, and we drove through the town towards the coast road that would lead eventually to Mozambique in Portuguese East Africa. In the second truck, the Askaris had a huge reel of telephone cable which they were going to lay along our route so that I could keep in touch with headquarters and be told the moment war was declared. There were no radios for that sort of thing out there. How much cable have you got? I asked the sergeant. How far along the road can we go? Only about 3 miles, Bwana, he answered, grinning. Just outside Dar es Salaam we stopped by a small hut and 2 signalers jumped out and unlocked the door and connected up our telephone cable to a plug inside. Then we drove on and the signalers fed the telephone cable out onto the grass verge as we went slowly forward. The road ran right along the edge of the Indian Ocean, and the water out there was calm and clear and pale green. I could see the sandy bottom under the water for a long way out, and on the little strip of sand between us and the water there grew those everlasting coconut palms waving their tops high up against the hot blue sky. It was a very beautiful sight, and a little breeze was blowing from the sea into the cabin of our truck. After a couple of miles, we came to a place where the road sloped steeply uphill and curved inland and went right through some very thick jungle. What about over there in the trees? I asked the sergeant. It is a good place, he said, so we stopped where the road entered the jungle and we climbed out of the trucks. Leave the trucks outside blocking the road, I said to the sergeant, and see that each man takes up a concealed position on the edge of the forest. The machine gun and all the rifles must be able to cover the road just beyond the blockade. When all this had been done, I took the sergeant aside and had a little talk with him in Swahili. Look, Sergeant, I said, I am sure you realize that I am not a soldier. I realize that, Bwana, he said politely, so if you see me doing something silly, please tell me. Yes, Bwana, he said. Are you happy with our positions? I asked him. I think everything is fine, Bwana, he said. So we hung around through the afternoon waiting for the field telephone to ring. I sat on the ground in a shady place near the phone and smoked my pipe. I remember I was wearing a khaki shirt, khaki shorts, khaki stockings and brown shoes, and I had a khaki topi on my head. That was the regular civilian way of dressing out there, and very comfortable it was. But I myself was far from comfortable in my mind. I was 23 and I had not yet been trained to kill anyone. I wasn't absolutely sure that I could bring myself to give the order to open fire on a bunch of German civilians in cold blood should the necessity arise. I was feeling altogether very uncomfortable in my skin. Darkness came and still the telephone did not ring. There was a 44-gallon drum of drinking water in one of the trucks and everyone helped himself. Then the sergeant made a fire out of sticks and began cooking supper for his men. He was making rice in an enormous pot, and while the rice was boiling he took from the truck a great stem of bananas and started snapping them off the stem one by one and peeling them and slicing them up and dropping the slices into the pot of rice. When the food was ready, each Askari produced his own tin plate and spoon, and the sergeant dished out large portions with a ladle. Up to then I hadn't thought about my own food, and I certainly had not brought anything with me. Watching the men eat made me hungry. Do you think I could have a little of that, please? I said to the sergeant. Yes, Bwana, he said. Have you got a plate? No, I said. So he found me a tin plate and a spoon and gave me a huge helping. It was absolutely delicious. The rice was unhusked and brown and the grains did not stick together. The slices of banana were hot and sweet and in some way they oiled the rice, as butter would. It was the best rice dish I had ever tasted and I ate it all and felt good and forgot about the Germans. Wonderful, I said to the sergeant. You are a fine cook. Whenever we are out of the barracks, he said, I must feed my men. It is something you have to learn when you become a sergeant. It was truly magnificent, I said. You should open a restaurant and become rich. All around us in the forest the frogs were croaking incessantly. African frogs have an unusually loud rasping croak and however far away from you they are, the sound always seems to be coming from somewhere near your feet. The croaking of frogs is the night music of the East African coast. The actual croak is made only by the bullfrog and he does it by blowing out his dewlap and letting it go with a burp. This is his mating call and when the female hears it she hops smartly over to the side of her prospective mate. But when she arrives a curious thing happens and it is not quite what you are thinking. The bullfrog does not turn and greet the female. Far from it. He ignores her totally and continues to sit there singing his song to the stars while the female waits patiently beside him. She waits and she waits and she waits. The male sings and he sings and he sings, often for several hours, and what has actually happened is this. The bullfrog has fallen so much in love with the sound of his own voice that he has completely forgotten why he started croaking in the first place. We know that he started because he was feeling sexy. But now he has become mesmerized by the lovely music he is making so that for him nothing else exists, not even the panting female at his side. There comes a time, though, when she loses all patience and starts nudging him hard with a foreleg, and only then does the bullfrog come out of his trance and turn to embrace her. Ah, well. The bullfrog, I told myself as I sat there in the dark forest, is not after all so very different from a lot of human males that I could think of. I borrowed an army blanket from the sergeant and settled down for the night beside the telephone. I thought briefly about snakes and wondered how many there were gliding about on the floor of the forest. Probably thousands. But the Askaris were chancing it, so why shouldn't I? The phone did not ring in the night and at dawn the sergeant built his fire again and cooked us some more rice and bananas. It didn't taste so good early in the morning. Shortly after 11 o'clock the tinkle of the field telephone made everybody jump. The voice on the other end said to me, Great Britain has declared war on Germany. You are now on full alert. Then he rang off. I told the sergeant to get all his men into their positions. For an hour or so nothing happened. The Askaris waited behind their guns and I waited out in the open beside the two trucks that were blocking the road. Then, suddenly, away in the distance I saw a cloud of dust. A little later, I could make out the first car, then close behind it a second and a third and a fourth. All the Germans in Dar must have made arrangements to assemble and travel together in convoy as soon as war was declared, for now. Could see a line of cars, each about 20 yards behind the one in front, stretching for half a mile down the road. There were trucks piled high with baggage. There were ordinary saloons with pieces of furniture strapped on their roofs. There were vans and there were station wagons. I called the sergeant out of the forest. Here they come, I said, and there's plenty of them. I want you to stay out of sight with the men. I shall remain here and meet the Germans. If I'll raise two arms above my head, like this, the machine gun and all the rifles are to fire one burst over the heads of these people. Not at them, you understand, but over their heads. Yes, Bwana, one burst over their heads. If there is violence towards me and they try to force their way through, then you will be in charge and must do whatever you think right. Yes, Bwana, the sergeant said, relishing the possibility. He returned to the forest. I stood out on the road waiting for the leader of the convoy to reach me. The lead car was a large Chevrolet station wagon driven by a man who had 2 more men beside him in the front seat. The rest of the car was filled with baggage. I put one hand up for him to stop, which he did. I felt like a traffic cop as I strolled over to the driver's window. I am afraid you cannot go any further, I said. You and all the others must turn around and go back to Dar es Salaam. One of my trucks will lead you. The other will bring up the rear of the convoy. What sort of bull is this? The man shouted with a heavy German accent. He was middle-aged with a thick neck and he was almost bald. Move those trucks off the road. Vi are going through. I'm afraid not, I said. You are now prisoners of war. The bald man got slowly out of the car. He was very angry and his movements were full of menace. The 2 men with him also got out. The bald man turned and signaled with his arm to the 50-odd cars that were lined up behind him, and immediately a man, and sometimes 2, got out of each car and came walking towards us. There were women and children in many of the cars as well, but they stayed where they were. I didn't at all like the way things were shaping up. What was I going to do, I asked myself, if they refused to go back and tried to barge their way through? I knew there and then that I could never quite bring myself to give the order for the machine gun to mow them all down. It would be an appalling massacre. I stood there and said nothing. In a few minutes a crowd of not less than 70 Germans were standing in a half-circle behind the bald man, who was clearly their leader. The bald man turned away from me and addressed his countrymen. Okay, he said. Let's get these 2 trucks off the road and move on. Hold it, I said, trying to sound twice my age. I have orders to stop you at all costs. If you try to go on, we shall shoot. Who will shoot? Asked the bald man contemptuously. He drew a revolver from the back pocket of his khaki trousers and I saw that it was one of those long-barreled Lugers. Immediately, at least half of the 70 or so men standing around him produced identical weapons. The bald man pointed his Luger at my chest. I had seen this sort of thing done 1,000 times in the cinema, but it was a very different thing in real life. I was properly frightened. I did my best not to show it. Then I raised both arms above my head. The bald man smiled. He thought it was a gesture of surrender. Crack! 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 All the guns behind me, including the machine gun, opened up and bullets went whistling over our heads. The Germans jumped. They quite literally jumped. Even the bald man jumped. And so did I. I lowered my hands. There is no way you can get through, I said. The first man who tries to go on from here will be shot. If all of you try, then all of you will be shot. Those are my orders. I have enough firepower in there to stop a regiment. There was absolute silence. The bald man lowered his Luger and suddenly his whole attitude changed. He gave me an ugly forced smile and said softly, "Why do you not let us through?" Because we are at war with Germany, I said, and you are all of German nationality, therefore you are the enemy. Vi are civilians, he said. Maybe you are, I said. But as soon as you get to Portuguese East, you'll find your way back to the fatherland and become soldiers. You are not going through. Suddenly he grabbed my arm and put his Luger to my chest. Then he raised his voice and screamed to my invisible troops in Swahili, "If you try to stop us, I am going to shoot your officer." What came next happened very suddenly. There was the crack of a single rifle shot fired from the wood, and the bald man who was holding me took the bullet right through his face. It was a horrible sight. The Luger dropped onto the road and the bald man fell dead beside it. All of us were shaken up, but I managed to pull myself together enough to say, "Come on, let us not have any more killings. Turn your vehicles round and follow our lead truck back to town. You will be well treated and the women and children will be allowed to go home." The crowd of men turned and walked sullenly back towards their cars. "Sergeant!" I shouted, and the sergeant came out of the forest at the double. "Put the dead man in one of the trucks and take it to the head of the convoy." I said to him, "You go with the front truck and lead them all to the prison camp. I shall bring up the rear in the second truck." "Very well, Bwana," the sergeant said. And that was how we captured the German civilians in Dar es Salaam when the war broke out. Disho of the Mwanamwizi. By the time we had seen the Germans safely into the prison camp and I had made my report, it was nearly midnight. I went off home to get a shower and some sleep. I was tired and dirty and I was feeling very unhappy about the killing of the bald-headed German. The captain at the barracks had congratulated me and said it was exactly the right thing to do, but that didn't help. When I got home, I went straight upstairs and took off my clothes. I took a long shower, then I put on a pair of pajamas and went downstairs again for a badly needed whiskey and soda. In the living room, I lay back in my armchair sipping the whiskey and ruminating upon the strange events of the last 36 hours. The whiskey felt good and I was slowly beginning to relax as the alcohol got into the bloodstream. Through the wide-open French windows I could hear the Indian Ocean pounding the cliffs below the house, and as always when I sat in that chair, I turned my head a little in order to allow my eyes to rest upon my beautiful silver Arab sword that hung on the wall over the door. I nearly dropped my whiskey. The sword was gone. The scabbard was still there, but the sword itself was not in it. I had bought my sword about a year before from the captain of an Arab dhow in Dar es Salaam harbor. This captain had sailed his old dhow clear across from Muscat to Africa on the northcast monsoon, and the journey had taken him 34 days. I happened to be down in the harbor when she came sailing in, and I gladly accepted the invitation of the customs officer to accompany him on board. That is where I found the sword and fell in love with it at first sight and bought it from the captain on the spot for 500 shillings. The sword was long and curved, and the silver scabbard was wonderfully chased with an intricate design showing various phases in the life of the Prophet. The curved blade was over 3 feet in length and was as sharp as a well-honed chisel. My friends in Dar es Salaam who knew about such things told me it was almost certainly from the middle of the 18th century and should properly be in a museum. I had carried my treasure back to the house and had handed it to Mdisho. "I want you to hang it on the wall over the door," I told him. "And I shall hold you responsible for seeing that the silver scabbard is always polished and the blade is wiped with an oily rag once a week to prevent it from rusting." Disho took the sword from me and examined it with reverence. Then he drew the blade from the scabbard and tested the edge with his thumb. "Aye," he cried out. "What a weapon! I could win a war with this in my hand." And now I sat in my armchair in the living room with my whiskey, staring appalled at the empty scabbard. "Disho!" I shouted. "Come here! Where is my sword?" There was no answer. He was probably in bed. I got up and went out to the back of the house where the native quarters were. There was a half-moon in the sky and plenty of stars, and I could see Piggy the cook squatting outside his hut with one of his wives. "Piggy," I said, "where is Mdisho?" Piggy was old and wrinkled, and he was very good at making baked potato with crab meat inside. He stood up when he saw me, and his woman disappeared into the shadows. "Where is Mdisho?" I said. "Mdisho went away early in the evening, Bwana." "Where to?" "I do not know. But he said he was coming back. Perhaps he has gone to see his father. You were away in the jungle, and I expect he thought you would not mind if he went off to pay a call on his father." "Where is my sword, Piggy?" "Your sword, Bwana? Is it not hanging over the door?" "It's gone," I said. I'm afraid someone may have stolen it. The big French windows into the sitting room were wide open when I came in. That is not right. No, Buona, that is not right. I don't understand it at all. Nor do I said. Go to bed. I went back into the house and flopped down again into the armchair. I felt too tired to move anymore. It was a very hot night. I reached up and switched off the reading light, then I closed my eyes and dozed off. I don't know how long I slept, but when I woke up it was still night and Disho was standing just inside the French windows with the light of the half-moon shining down on him from behind. He was breathing fast and there was a wild ecstatic look on his face and he was naked except for a small pair of black cotton shorts. His superb black body was literally dripping with sweat. In his right hand he held the sword. I sat up abruptly. Disho, where have you been? Little flashes of moonlight were glinting on the sword and I noticed that the middle of the blade was darkened with something that looked to me very much like dried blood. Disho! I cried. For heaven's sake, what have you done? Buona, he said, oh Buona, I have had a most tremendous victory. I think you will be very pleased about it when I tell you. Tell me, I said. I was getting nervous. I had never seen Disho like this before. The wild look on his face and the heavy breathing and the sweat all over his body made me more nervous than ever. Tell me at once, Elle said again. Explain to me what you have been doing. When he started to speak, the words came rushing out in a cascade of crazy excited sentences, and he didn't stop until he had finished his story. I didn't interrupt him, and I will try to give you a fairly literal translation from the Swahili of what he said as he stood there looking so splendid in the open doorway with the half-moon shining on him from behind. Buona, he said, Buona, yesterday down in the market I heard that we had started to fight the Germani and I remembered all that you had said about how they would try to kill us. As soon as I heard the news, I started to run back to the house, and as I ran I shouted to everyone I saw in the streets. I shouted, we are fighting the Germani! We are fighting the Germani! In my country, as soon as we hear that someone is coming to fight us, the whole tribe must know about it as soon as possible. So I ran home shouting the news to the people as I went, and I was also thinking of what I, Disho, could do to help. Suddenly, I remembered the rich Germani that lives over the hills, the sisal planter whom we visited in your car not long ago. Then I ran even faster towards home, and when I arrived I ran through the kitchen and shouted at Piggy the cook, we are fighting the Germani. I ran into this room and took hold of the sword, this wonderful sword which I have been polishing for you every day. Buona, I was very excited to be at war. You were already out with the Ascari on the roads, and I knew that I should do something too. So I pulled the sword out of its glove and ran outside with it. I ran towards the house of the rich Ciceloning Germani over the hills. I did not go by the road because the Ascaris might have stopped me when they saw me running with the sword in my hand. I ran straight through the forest and when I got to the top of the hills, I looked down the other side and saw the great plantation of sisal belonging to the rich Germani. Away beyond it I could see his house, the big white house we visited together, and I set off again down the other side of the hill into the sisal. By then it was getting dark and it was not easy dodging around the tall prickly sisal plants, but I went on running. Then I saw the white house in front of me in the moonlight and I ran straight up to the front door and pushed it open. I ran into the first room I saw and it was empty. There was a table with some food on it but the room was empty. Then I ran towards the back of the house and pushed open a door at the end of the passage. That was empty too, but suddenly through the window I saw the big Germani standing in the back garden and he had a fire going and he was throwing pieces of paper onto the fire. He had many sheets of paper on the ground beside him and he kept picking up more and more and throwing them onto the fire. And Buona, there was a huge elephant gun lying on the ground by his feet. I pushed open the back door and I ran out and the Germani heard me and jumped round and started to reach for the gun but I gave him no time. I had the sword raised in both my hands and I swung it at his neck as he bent down to pick up the gun. Bwana, it is a beautiful sword. With one blow it cut through his neck so deeply that his whole head fell forward and dangled down onto his chest, and as he started to topple over I gave the neck one more quick chop and the head came right away from the body and fell to the ground like a coconut. I felt good then, Bwana, I really felt awfully good, and I remember wishing I had had you with me to see it all happening. But you were far away on the coast road with your Askaris doing the same sort of thing to lots of other Germani, so I hurried home. I came home by the road because it was faster and I didn't care any more about the Askaris seeing me. I ran all the way and the sword was in my hand and sometimes I waved it above my head as I ran, but I never stopped. Twice people shouted at me and once 2 men ran after me, but I was flying like a bird and I was bringing good news back home. It is a long distance, Bwana, and it took 4 hours each way. That is why I am so late. I am sorry to be so late. Disho stopped. He had finished his story. I knew it was true. The German Sicilioner was called Fritz Kleiber and he was a wealthy and extremely unpleasant bachelor. It was rumored that he treated his workers badly and had been known to beat them with a sjambok, which is a murderous whip made of rhinoceros hide. I wondered why he hadn't been rounded up by our people before Mdisho got to him. They were probably on the way out there now. They were in for a shock. And you, Bwana! Disho cried out. How many did you get today? How many what? I said. Germani, Bwana, Germani. How many did you get with that fine machine gun you had out on the road? I looked at him and smiled. I refused to blame him for what he had done. He was a wild Mwanamwezi tribesman who had been molded by us Europeans into the shape of a domestic servant, and now he had broken the mold. Have you told anyone else what you have done? Not yet, Bwana, I came to you first. Now listen carefully, I said. You must tell nobody about this, not your father, not your wives, not your best friend and not Piggy the cook. Do you understand me? But I must tell them, he cried. You cannot take that pleasure away from me, Bwana. You must not tell them, Mdisho, I said. But why not, he cried. Have I done something wrong? Quite the opposite, I lied. Then why must I not tell my people, he asked again. I tried to explain to him how the authorities would react if they found him out. It simply wasn't done to go round chopping heads off civilians, even in wartime. It could mean prison, I told him, or even worse than that. He couldn't believe me. He was absolutely shattered. I myself am tremendously proud of you, I said, trying to make him feel better. To me you are a great hero. But only to you, Bwana? No, Mdisho. I think you would be a hero to most of the British people here if they knew what you had done. But that doesn't help. It is the police who would go after you. The police, he cried in horror. If there was one thing at Dar es Salaam that every local was terrified of, it was the police. The police constables were all blacks, acting under a couple of white officers at the top, and they were not famous for being gentle with prisoners. Yes, I said, the police. I felt pretty sure they would charge Mdisho with murder if they caught him. If it is the police, then I will keep quiet, Bwana, he said, and all of a sudden he looked so downcast and disillusioned and defeated that I couldn't bear it. I got up from the chair and crossed the room and took the scabbard of the sword down from the wall. I shall be leaving you very soon, I said. I have decided to join the war as a flyer of aeroplanes. The only word for aeroplane in the Swahili language is ndege, which means bird, and it always sounded good and descriptive in a sentence. I am going to fly birds, I said. I shall fly English birds against the birds of the Germani. Wonderful! Disho cried, brightening again suddenly at the mention of war. I will come with you, Bwana. Sadly, that will be impossible, I said. In the beginning I shall be nothing but a very humble bird soldier of the lowest rank, like your most junior askaris here, and I shall be living in barracks. There would be no question of me being allowed to have somebody to help me. I shall have to do everything for myself, including the washing and ironing of my shirts. That would be absolutely impossible, Bwana, Disho said. He was genuinely shocked. I shall manage quite well, I told him. But do you know how to iron a shirt, Bwana? No, I said. You must teach me that secret before I go. Will it be very dangerous, Bwana, where you are going? And do those Germani birds have many guns? It might be dangerous, I said, but the first 6 months will be nothing but fun. It takes 6 months for them to teach you how to fly a bird. Where will you go? He asked. First to Nairobi, I answered. They will start us on very small birds in Nairobi, and then we will go somewhere else to fly the big ones. We shall be traveling a great deal with very little luggage. That is why I shall have to leave this sword behind. It would be impossible to carry a great big thing like this with me wherever I go. So I am giving it to you. To me, he cried. Oh no, Bwana, you mustn't do that, you will need it where you are going. Not in a bird, I said. There is no room to swing a sword when you are sitting in one of those. I handed him the beautiful curved silver scabbard. You have earned it, I said. Now go away and wash the blade very well indeed. Make sure there is no trace of blood left on it anywhere. Then wipe it with oil and return it to its glove. Tomorrow L shall hand you a chit saying that I have given it to you. The chit is important. He stood there holding the sword in one hand and the scabbard in the other, staring at them with eyes as bright as 2 stars. But one thing you might do, let me know by telegram if you change your address, that is if it isn't too expensive. And mind you do change your address pretty soon. It's absolute madness to stay anywhere in the east of England now. You'll have parachute troops landing on the lawn if you don't look out. I am presenting it to you for bravery. I said. But you must not tell that to anybody. Tell them simply that I gave it to you as a going-away present. Yes, Bwana, he said. That is what I shall tell them. He paused for a moment and looked me straight in the eye. Tell me truthfully, Bwana, he said, are you really and truly glad that I killed the big Germani sisal grower? We killed one today as well, I said. You did? Disho cried.